These are your controlled headlines for Saturday, August 7th. While the House of Representatives goes on its recess without a floor vote on protecting states' legal, medical, and adult use cannabis businesses, the Senate continues to make moves on cannabis reform, as the Senate Appropriations Committee advanced a measure known as the Veterans Equal Access Amendment, which would restrict the Department of Veterans Affairs from taking disciplinary actions against VA doctors solely for the act of issuing medical cannabis recommendations in a manner that is compliant with their state's laws. Senate leaders also released a massive and long-anticipated infrastructure bill, and after weeks of bipartisan negotiations, the legislation includes provisions that aim to allow researchers to study the actual cannabis that consumers are purchasing from state legal dispensaries instead of having to use only government-grown cannabis. The bill also encourages states that have enacted legalization laws to educate people about impaired driving. Meanwhile, a GOP senator who is the top co-sponsor of cannabis banking legislation is also seeking to prevent people from using federal financial assistance at cannabis dispensaries as part of a new large-scale welfare bill. Senator Steve Daines, Republican of Montana, the lead Republican sponsor of the Secure and Fair Enforcement, or SAFE Banking Act, included language in a separate welfare-related bill that would make it so people could not use temporary assistance for needy families funds at, quote, any establishment that offers marijuana for sale, unquote. Activists say the bill unfairly targets the most vulnerable people and perpetuates cannabis stigmas. The title of the provision itself, The Welfare for Needs, Not Weed, has on its own drawn the ire of legalization advocates, who argue it unnecessarily plays into the negative cannabis stereotypes. They also argue that it is inappropriate to tell medical cannabis patients they can't use funds for their medicine. A California state senator is asking the head of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services to provide clarification on whether hospitals and other healthcare facilities in legal cannabis states can allow terminally ill patients to use medical cannabis without jeopardizing federal funds. State Senator Ben Hueso, a Democrat, has sent a letter to the HHS Secretary Javier Becerra and Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services Administrator Chiquita Brooks-LaSure, inquiring about the policy. Confusion about possible implications for permitting cannabis consumption in health facilities led pro-legalization Governor Gavin Newsom to veto a bill known as Ryan's Law, sponsored by the senator, meant to address this issue in 2019. The senator hopes this clarification will prevent a second veto. Making history, Ohio lawmakers have formally introduced a bill to legalize cannabis possession, production, and sales, the first effort of its kind in the state legislature. This comes as activists are pursuing a separate ballot initiative that would effectively force the legislature to consider similar cannabis reforms. Representatives Casey Weinstein, a Democrat, and Terrence Upchurch, a Democrat, filed the legislation weeks after circulating a co-sponsorship memo to colleagues to build support for the measure. The 180-page bill would legalize possession of up to 5 ounces of cannabis for adults 21 and over and allow them to cultivate up to 12 plants for personal use and a 10% tax. It also includes provisions to expunge prior convictions for possession and cultivation activities that are being made legal under the measure. An appeals panel in Texas issued a mixed judgment Thursday in a lawsuit challenging the state's ban on smokable hemp. Regulators may enforce a ban on the processing and manufacturing of products intended for smoking or vaping, the court ruled, but they cannot prevent such products made elsewhere from being sold in the state. The decision creates a situation in which consumers may be able to freely purchase smokable hemp flower and hemp-derived CBD oils for vaping, but only if the products are processed outside Texas and imported into the state. Big news out of Oklahoma, as a group of activists wants to put a pair of cannabis initiatives on the state ballot in 2022, one that would overhaul the state's massive medical cannabis system and another to legalize cannabis for adults 21 and older. While the medical and adult use measures would appear on the ballot separately, they're designed to work together and even overlap to some degree. The medical proposal would create a new state agency to regulate all types of legal cannabis, including hemp and high-THC cannabis, and would establish funding for programs including research, environmental remediation, and mental health services. The adult use proposal, meanwhile, would allow any adult 21 and older to purchase cannabis products from existing dispensaries. Individuals could also grow up to 12 cannabis plants at home and keep or give away the cannabis it produces. The adult use proposal would also make changes to the medical program and the state's criminal justice system. If passed, it would establish a 15% tax on non-medical sales, to adults, but reduce taxes on medical products from the current 7% tax down to 0. It would also provide for the expungement of past cannabis-related convictions. In addition to Oklahoma, NORML is reporting that cannabis reform activists in 7 other states around the country are already working to qualify various statewide reform measures for the 2022 ballot. Those include Arkansas, Idaho, Missouri, Nebraska, Ohio, South Dakota, and Wyoming. This from The Intercept. Last week, the New York Times reported that Biden administration lawyers had concluded that the Trump administration memo correctly interpreted the law and that thousands of people in home confinement must be returned to prison after the yet-to-be-determined end of the, quote, pandemic emergency period, unquote. About 2,000 people stand to be impacted, with the rest having now completed enough of their sentence to qualify for early release under the standard guidance. The Biden Justice Department's position is especially shocking, considering President Biden, after all, campaigned on loosening drug laws and said that people with cannabis records would comprise a relatively small percentage of the federal prison population, and they should be freed. On the campaign trail, candidate Biden said this.
I'll be very brief. Number one, I think we should decriminalize marijuana, period. And I think anyone who has a record should be let out of jail, their record's expunged, it be completely zeroed out. But I do think it makes sense, based on data, that we should study what the long-term effects are for the use of marijuana. That's all it is. Number one, everybody gets out, record expunged. Second,
everybody gets out, record expunged. Do better, Joe. Meanwhile, another Biden appointee seems to think locking people up for cannabis is a bad idea. The nation's top doctor said recently that it's time to stop incarcerating people for marijuana use. Surgeon General Vivek Murthy was asked this question on CNN.
Well, when it comes to marijuana, Dan, I think we have to let science guide us. And we know that the science tells us that there are some benefits for marijuana from a medical perspective, but there are also some harms that we have to consider, and we have to put those together as we think about the right policy. Now, when it comes to decriminalization, I don't think that there is value to individuals or to society to lock people up for marijuana use. I don't think that serves anybody well.
Since we're following science, Dr. Murthy, let's start by calling it cannabis and not marijuana. Finally, Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer has unveiled the draft of a comprehensive cannabis reform bill that would legalize the plant federally by removing it from the Controlled Substances Act, while letting states continue to decide whether to prohibit or allow commercial sales. The Cannabis Administration and Opportunities Act builds on the MORE Act in a number of ways, including a graduated tax scheme from 10 to 25%. But the measure faces a daunting challenge in the U.S. Senate, where the bill will likely require 60 votes for passage, meaning at least 10 Republicans would have to be on board. And in reality, Senator Schumer won't have the support of a number of conservative Senate Democrats. So the bill that actually comes out of this discussion draft may be significantly different than this most comprehensive version. The public comment period is open until September 1st. Anyone interested in cannabis reform should provide comments to cannabis_reform@finance.senate.gov. While the House of Representatives did manage to approve a large-scale spending bill before they took off for recess, the approved package of spending legislation contains measures to provide protections for banks that work with state legal cannabis businesses, and also allows legalization of cannabis sales in Washington, D.C., among other drug policy provisions. The appropriations legislation and attached reports also direct federal government agencies to reconsider policies that fire employees for using cannabis in compliance with state law, criticize restrictive hemp regulations, encourage CBD to be allowed in foods, and urge expanded research on marijuana and other substances. Early in July, a group of 18 congressional lawmakers signed a letter condemning the suspension of star Olympic sprinter Sha'Carri Richardson from participating in the competition this year because of a failed marijuana test. They are requesting the athletic governing bodies make a policy change to prevent it from happening again. They said the Sha'Carri Richardson suspension for marijuana use highlights an arbitrary distinction that makes less sense than ever before. Meanwhile, A.J. Harrington writes in Forbes, "Cannabis takes the world stage at the Tokyo Olympics." For the first time in the Olympics' 125-year modern history, elite athletes are being open about their use of cannabis products to prepare them for the world's biggest stage in sports. Leading the charge is Olympic gold medalist and U.S. soccer women's national team star Megan Rapinoe, who incorporates CBD into her training routine using products from Mendi, a company founded by her sister, Rachel Rapinoe, and Brett Schwager. So Sha'Carri Richardson sits out the Olympics as Megan Rapinoe promotes CBD. According to WAMU, critics are outraged over alleged hypocrisy and even racism, saying the anti-doping agency for the Games is turning a blind eye for the white athlete on the heels of suspending black sprinter Sha'Carri Richardson after testing positive for marijuana earlier this month. NORML has announced that it has updated and revised its publication, Clinical Applications for Cannabis and Cannabinoids, a review of the recent scientific literature 2000 through 2021. This updated edition reviews over 450 peer-reviewed studies assessing the safety and efficacy of either whole plant cannabis or individual cannabinoids in 23 different patient populations, including autism, chronic pain, diabetes, fibromyalgia, migraine, and post-traumatic stress. Since NORML issued the previous edition of this report in 2017, scientists have published thousands of studies relevant to the medicinal properties of cannabis. This is reflected in NORML's new report, which highlights nearly 100 newly published studies, making it one of the most up-to-date and comprehensive compendiums of the utility of medical cannabis available. This story from Forbes: cannabis and other drugs have been illegally smuggled into the United States from Colombia for decades, but global cannabis cultivator Clever Leaves, which has a grow facility in the Andes Mountains, plans to import $25 million worth of pharmaceutical-grade marijuana to supply researchers in the U.S. Clever Leaves, which boasts 1.8 million square feet of cultivation space across 18 greenhouses in Pesca, Colombia, partnered with California-based biopharmaceutical research company, which has a license with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, to import cannabis legally. Clever Leaves will supply federally approved researchers to study cannabis for the future development of new pharmaceutical therapies and medicines. Kyle Detweiler, CEO of Clever Leaves, says the company hopes to advance the science around cannabis as a pharmaceutical product. Quote, "Cannabis does not belong on Schedule 1. It's time to change that," unquote, says Detweiler, referring to how marijuana is listed under the federal government's most restrictive categories. This reported in Westworld, holders of the first cannabis research license in Colorado for clinical trials, Denver-based MedPharm Holdings has been leading the state in medical marijuana research by focusing on neuropharmacology and Alzheimer's disease. But without federal approval, MedPharm still struggles to gain wider acceptance in the traditional medicinal world. MedPharm is currently waiting on a final verdict from the Drug Enforcement Administration for a license to grow federally approved cannabis for medical research. The company has been waiting since 2016 for a decision from the DEA, but is optimistic one will be made soon after the agency reached out with some follow-up application recommendations this year. Well, it looks like Apple is finally easing its policy on cannabis businesses as the first full-service marijuana delivery app launches on the Apple Store. Ease has launched an updated iPhone app that finally allows people to purchase and pay for marijuana deliveries with the app. This comes shortly after Apple instituted an Apple Store policy change that removed restrictions on cannabis businesses. You still can't use a credit card, only a debit or cash. In other Schedule 1 news, psychedelics decriminalization advancing in 3 more cities spanning from coast to coast. From Massachusetts to California, advocates are actively making new strides to reform local laws governing psychedelics like psilocybin and ayahuasca, building on a national movement that has already seen numerous cities decriminalize ethnogenic substances. New cities include East Hampton, Massachusetts, Grand Rapids, Michigan, and Arcata, California, where the Arcata Public Safety Committee is back decriminalizing psychedelic plants and fungi. The Arcata Public Safety Committee voted to return the resolution to decriminalize the use of psychoactive mushrooms and other ethnogenic plants back to the Arcata City Council for a final vote. The proposal was brought forth by Decriminalize Nature Humboldt during the Arcata City Council's July 21st meeting. Following a split vote on a motion to move forward, the council agreed to send the proposal to the Public Safety Committee for additional review. The city has the power to prioritize where law enforcement goes and then where the resources go for that, said Dr. Larry Norris, co-founder of the Oakland-based campaign Decriminalize Nature. Quote, "It doesn't change the law. There are no changes to municipal code, but deprioritization really allows for the city to say, hey, plants and mushrooms aren't really a big priority for us. We have other things going on." And finally, the Oregon Health Authority and the Oregon Psilocybin Advisory Board have reached a milestone in the effort to build the nation's first state psilocybin therapy program. The board, a governor-appointed advisory board created by the passage of Ballot Measure 109 in November, completed the report summary and findings showing that the active ingredient in psychedelic mushrooms holds promise as an option to address mental health issues. Those are your controlled headlines for August 7th. Follow me at DC420LA on Twitter for breaking cannabis news.